Guinea and give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. Once again, we find ourselves in the Security Council before a surreal farce that 3 Western countries, permanent members in this council, repeat, donning the mantle of the humanitarian pen holders. They have engaged since the last briefing from OCHA in drafting a biased political resolution. It's a political and not humanitarian draft resolution on what they called ceasefire in northwest Syria. It's now confirmed that the ink of this pen dries when it comes to war crimes and crimes against humanity committed and are still being committed by what is called the international coalition led by the US and their proxies from terrorist organizations and affiliated illegitimate militias. The ink of this pen dries when it comes to the illegal foreign presence on the territories of my country, be they American, British, French, or Turkish, as well as the repeated Israeli aggression encouraged by the silence of this council and the immunity provided by some permanent members of this council to the practices of the Israeli occupying authorities for decades. Some colleagues, Mr. President, said that combating terrorism does not shrink us from the responsibilities of international humanitarian law. However, I did not hear those same colleagues saying, for example, that producing terrorism does not allow you not to shoulder your responsibilities along international law and the UN Charter. Both the international law and the UN Charter and its provisions have priority before the international humanitarian law. Let's say on equal footing. But if you want to respect the international humanitarian law, you must first respect the provisions of the UN Charter and international law. History will remember this session. Yes, indeed, since it came to just distract from the Russian presidency, as was the case a few years back when the Russian Federation was heading the council, and there were attempts by some to table resolutions again to disrupt this presidency. History repeating itself because they do not want to assist the Syrian people, but to misuse this file politically and embarrass the Russian presidency. Just like the previous resolutions adopted by the Council, the draft resolution provides in the second preamble paragraph the following. The Security Council reaffirming its strong commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. End of quote. However, the practices of the pen holders have proved the presence of a huge gap between the principle and application of this particular paragraph. The holders of the humanitarian slogan have violated the sovereignty of the Syrian Arab Republic. This is unacceptable. How can the humanitarian pen holders undertake their duties and lead this movement, which is supposedly underpinned by humanitarian drivers, at a time when they called for this meeting and tabled a draft resolution without coordination or consultation with the delegation of the Syrian Arab Republic? We are the delegation that is concerned first and foremost in discussing such a draft resolution. How can they disregard the fact that the Syrian government has agreed to a ceasefire in the de-escalation zone in Idlib starting from the 31st of August, while maintaining the right to respond to any violation by terrorists in line with the Astana Agreement on establishing de-escalation zones and the Sochi Agreement. We have the right to wonder why did the pen holders neglected in their draft resolution any reference to carving out terrorist organizations from the hostilities. It's known to all that the Astana Agreement on establishing de-escalation regions does not include the armed groups designated by the Security Council as terrorist entities. The agreement provided for a number of pledges, including compelling the armed groups, the signatories of Astana, to disengage with terrorist organizations, especially ISIL or Daesh and Nusra Front and other affiliated groups. Both the Astana and Sochi agreements underlined the right of the government of Syria and their allies to counter terrorist organizations irrespective of their names. All of this was absent in the draft resolution tabled by the humanitarian pen holders. How can those humanitarian pen holders claim they're keen on the humanitarian situation in Syria when they disregard in the draft resolution the main reason behind the humanitarian crisis in the country? That is, the terrorism, unfortunately sponsored by some countries' members in this council. They also disregard the fact that there are thousands of foreign terrorist fighters in Syria. Here, just as an example, would like to refer to the fact that the German government announced recently, following a parliamentary questioning submitted by the expert in internal affairs in the Liberal Party, Konstantin Kuhle, that the number of German FTFs in Syria and Iraq amounts to 500 terrorists. Around 360 of them are still fighting in the ranks of terrorist organizations. These are the statistics of the German government. They underline what is confirmed, that is, the presence of thousands of terrorists from Europe. How can my colleague, the permanent member of Germany, neglect this important information coming from his government and disregards any reference to the fact that we have to counter the phenomena of FTFs and that their countries and masters must withdraw them from Syria? And by the way, and based on the request of the representative of Kuwait in the previous meeting, when you talked about the Salafi movement in Kuwait, and you said it does not exist, and you mentioned al-Mtari, that terrorist, he said he does not exist. This is an announcement distributed by the Salafi movement in Kuwait. We can see pictures of Kuwaiti nationals under the title Wage War Jihad in Syria. They all are members of the Salafi movement. This is a poster that was in the streets of Kuwait. Another publication or poster. New York Times, in an article that also the representative of Kuwait said does not exist, here is a copy of it. It talked about al-Mtari, who's a sergeant in the Kuwaiti army. It was written by the New York Times.
Ghanem al-Mtari gathers the funds and transports them to Syria for the rebels fighting President Bashar al-Assad. Mr. Mtari, one of dozens of Kuwaitis who openly raise money to arm the opposition, has helped turn this tiny oil-rich Persian Gulf state into a virtual Western Union outlet for Syria's rebels, with the bulk of the funds he collects going to a Syrian affiliate to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda. One Kuwait-based effort raised money to equip 12,000 rebel fighters for $2,500 each. اسمعوا هذه العبارة.
Listen to that.
Earn silver status by giving $175 for 50 sniper bullets, or gold status by giving twice as much for 8 mortar rounds. أما معهد كارنيجي
the American Carnegie Center, has produced 2 studies on the Kuwaiti Salafi movement. This American center has produced 2 studies and the support provided by this movement to terrorism in Syria and Iraq. The delegate of Kuwait said, if I have any names or documents, please present them. Here I am presenting those documents. If you want copies, please contact the delegation. The permanent delegation of Syria to the United Nations in New York. Mr. President, how can the humanitarian pen holders and the sponsors of the draft resolution claim that they are keen for the humanitarian situation when they participated from day one in what is called the illegitimate international coalition against Daesh, which has not combated terrorism in any day? Instead, they have intentionally and systematically destroyed the Syrian infrastructure, including bridges above the Euphrates River, the grain silos, hospitals, schools, and safe cities. And they killed thousands of civilians and saved the leaders of terrorists in my country, Hajin and Bahur, in Deir ez-Zor and in Raqqa, to recycle them and use them in other countries as moderate terrorist democratic opposition. How can they claim their keenness for humanitarian issues when the draft resolution disregards the dangerous announcement of the US and Turkey on reaching an agreement on establishing a safe zone on Syrian territories and starting joint patrols? It's an agreement that would complicate and prolongate the crisis in Syria through establishing new facts on the ground in areas where the forces of those two occupying countries are deployed illegally. How can the humanitarian pen holders claim they're keen for the humanitarian issues when they contribute in economic terrorism by imposing unilateral coercive economic measures with grave catastrophic consequences on Syrians? It undermines the ability of the government of Syria to respond to their livelihood needs. To conclude, Mr. President, and based on the above, my government would like to thank all those who have voted against the draft resolution, especially Russia and China, and those who have abstained to uphold the principles of international law and the provisions of the UN Charter, foremost the respect of states' sovereignty and the non-interference in their internal affairs. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic, and